This time we are visiting Luke chapter 6. So take a hold of your mobile device, your Bible, your computer, and let's turn to Luke chapter 6. We're going to look at Luke chapter 6 in two parts. This is Sabbath and Work, part A, and then part B will be in our next segment. For this segment, let's look at Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Again, I'll be reading from the King James. Luke chapter 6, verse 1. And it came to pass on the second Sabbath after the first, that he went through the cornfields, and his disciples plucked the ears of corn, and did eat, rubbing them in their hands. And certain of the Pharisees said unto them, Why do you that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath days? And Jesus has an answer. This is verse 3. Jesus answering them said, Have you not read so much as this, what David did when himself was hungry, and they which were with him? How he, meaning David, went into the house of God, and did take and eat the showbread, and gave also to them that were with him, which is not lawful to eat, but for the priest alone. So this is a massive question, and these are going to be several things that we're going to point out. So we're going to take our time with this, because hopefully I'm going to be talking about some things that are not frequently talked about, and we're hopefully going to be talking about these in productive ways. So this is a question about Sabbath. This is a question about what do you do on the Sabbath. This is a question about what is work on the Sabbath. And these are very proper questions, and these are important questions. So in Luke chapter 6, verse 2, we know that there are Pharisees who are asking this question. The question is this the house of Hillel? Is this the house of Shammai? We don't really know. It could be some from each camp. We don't really know from the context. But what's under question is Rabbi Yeshua's interpretation. What is Sabbath work? That's how I've kind of termed this. So Rabbi Yeshua is saying these kinds of things about the Sabbath, and the other rabbis have talked in another way about the Sabbath. So I want to make it clear that Jesus is Torah observant. Now there are several different ways in which Torah is understood. First of all, it's the written Torah of the law of Moses, called the Pentateuch. There's also another law called the oral law. This oral law is what's transferred and ascribed not just the Pharisees, but to the sages before them, being transmitted and received all the way back from Moses at Sinai. Now, there's lots of discussion and debate about the oral Torah, but for you and for me, we have to accept that this does exist, and there are times that Jesus does actually uphold the oral Torah. So that's an interesting aspect of his own ministry. But what Jesus is doing is he's saying, okay, what does the written Torah say? What does the oral Torah say? And then he's also going to bring into the prophets, which we've talked about previously, into this discussion. So the oral Torah has its own traditions, has its own interpretations, has its teachings that go down through it. So one of the things that is definitely supported, I would name two things. It's the Seder tradition, and that's a traditional meal eaten at Passover. But also I would ascribe synagogue attendance. So let's go back to Luke chapter 6, verse 1. Let's read this again. And it came to pass on the second Sabbath after the first. So I'm not really sure when that time frame is, but the wording is significant. And he went through the cornfields, and his disciples plucked the ears of corn, did eat, rubbing them in their hands. Okay, so let's first of all establish something. What Jesus is doing with his disciples when they walk through someone's field and they take of the wheat or the grain is actually completely lawful, Torahful. Go to Deuteronomy 23, verse 25. When you come to the standing corn of their neighbor, then you may pluck from the ears with your hand, but you shall not take a sickle to your neighbor's standing corn. So the Torah itself, the law of Moses, the Pentateuch, permits Jesus and his disciples to do exactly what they did. The question is, can they do what they did and do it on Sabbath? That's the interesting question. Because what is being supported by the Torah? Here's the argument. According to the written Torah, which is the law of Moses, and according to the prophets, what constitutes work on the Sabbath. So what is being questioned is not the collecting of grain, but whether or not the collecting of grain and the preparation of that grain for eating it on the Sabbath day is the constitution of and being the equivalent of reaping and threshing on the Sabbath. Okay, so this is an important thing because Jesus does not use, well, I'm not taking a sickle to the wheat, therefore I'm not reaping, and I'm not using stones, or not stones, but the winnowing fork to thresh. He's not doing that type of argument. So he's answering a very serious question with a means that doesn't really come straight to us. So, are the Pharisees asking a bad question? I'm saying no. They ask a perfectly legitimate question, a type of question that's even asked today. What's biblical? What does the Bible say about X, Y, and Z? What does the Bible say about A, B, C? What is it that I can do? Or someone accuses me, or someone accuses you of not doing something according to the Bible. Then you have to be able to defend it. So these are the things that happen and exist even down into modernity. Now, because the Pharisees received such negative attention, some people disparage their question as being a legalist. I am not going to say that these people are doing negative things at all. They're asking a very important question, questions that get asked even today. So the question is not a legalist perspective, it's an interpretist perspective. Meaning, how do you interpret the scriptures? These types of things matter. So let us go back to the book of Exodus. During the Exodus, Israel is commanded to gather twice the amount on the day of preparation, the day of Friday, the day prior to the day of Sabbath, because they're collecting for Friday and they're collecting for Sabbath. Okay? That is found in Exodus 22 through verse 30. Exodus 16, 22 through 30. So the question is, since they were instructed on Friday to gather out for Sabbath, has Jesus violated the spirit of the Torah? This is a very important question that the Pharisees are asking. So, to defend himself and to defend his disciples, where does Jesus go? He goes to King David. Now, this is a very interesting incident. This incident is recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1 through 6. And as we saw in other segments prior to this, this is part of the Nevi'im, the prophets. So Jesus is not appealing to the Torah. He's not appealing to the oral Torah. Jesus is appealing to an incident that happens in the Nevi'im, the second part of a three-part collection, because they're writing it down here. So he's in this section of the scriptures. Now, this is very interesting. So, what we do know is that the showbread was only designated and only permitted to be eaten by the priest. We know this from verse 9 of Leviticus 24, where you have Leviticus 24, 5 to 9, specifying what you do with the showbread. Here's verse 9, according to the King James. And it, meaning the showbread, shall be Aaron's and his sons, and they shall eat it in the holy place, for it is most holy unto him of the offerings of the Lord made by fire for a perpetual statute. So Jesus and his use of 1 Samuel 21, 1 to 6, almost doesn't answer the question, because technically King David violates the Torah, and so did the priest by giving him the bread. So let us go back to 1 Samuel 21 and look at verse 6, because that's where our answer sets. So I'm just going to say it for brevity. There was no other bread but the showbread. That means that priest had nothing else to offer. If you want to say it, all of his options are extinguished. What do I do to help the king? Because the only thing I have is what I have for the Lord, and it's my own stuff, because it's reserved for the priest. So it appears that what Jesus is doing is that when there is no other means available, no other options available to the person, that like King David, a man who is after God's own heart, a person can technically violate the Torah. Now that's interesting, because that poses a little bit of a problem. Because when you study 1 Samuel 21, in those first 6 verses, both the king and the priest violate the instructions. So, we have a big question. Is Jesus violating Torah? Is Jesus advocating the violating of Torah? Is Jesus tossing out the Torah itself, like he's walking on it and throwing it away as if it's no good, saying it's null and void? Well, first of all, you could go back to Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, 18, 19. That would be part of your answer. But the big answer from this part is no. Jesus is not. Jesus is not advocating the throwing away of the Torah. He's advocating that under extenuating circumstances, you're permitted to violate the technicalities of the Torah in order to do one thing: accomplish good. So, what did the priest accomplish? Because there was no other option for the priest, he gave to David and those who were with him what is reserved only for the priest. In this action, the priest showed that he knew how to follow Leviticus 19:18, love your neighbor, which is the core principle of what Jesus taught. So what we find is that Jesus says a technicality can be set aside when you are trying to do another part of Torah which says do good unto your neighbor. So these are very technical aspects of the Torah itself, living according to Torah, and how Jesus is still Torah observant and yet is the Messiah and teaches grace and mercy. So what we want to do here is I want to give a little bit of credit to the sages and the Pharisees, because they're not given a lot of credit, but their interpretation of being very strict for the Sabbath is actually very helpful, because at the end of the day they also want to help their neighbor. Because if you go back into the Torah, if you violate it, you can die for doing the wrong thing on Sabbath. So being very strict in their interpretation is very helpful, because they love their neighbor. They want their neighbor to live and survive. So this is something that I'm going to say is good for the sages and the Pharisees. But there is a big question about what's going on here, and I'm hoping that I've addressed some of it. We're going to talk about a little bit more in our next part. So as for this particular passage regarding Jesus himself, I just want to show and iterate again. Jesus knows his Torah, Jesus knows his Nevi'im, the prophets, and Jesus knows the oral Torah. And all of these come into play into this one moment.